In today's video, we're going to find out what tractors, air conditioners, and this rifle all have in common. What I'm holding, of course, is an M1 Garand that we talked about in the previous video. This particular one has an interesting history because it was made by the International Harvester Company. Yes, the maker of tractors, sometimes air conditioners, during World War II half-tracks for the government, actually almost went bankrupt trying to build this rifle. But first, let's back up and see how it all came together. International Harvester's contract with the United States government was an unlikely one at the end of World War II. No one can conceive of the Korean conflict that was on the horizon being as large as it was, as fast as it happened related to current events. So the government was a bit ill-prepared and had dwindling numbers of this because they had sent a lot of them out of the country for military aid. Because of that, the government wanted to hire civilian companies to potentially build the rifle, which they ultimately talked International Harvester into doing. Another thing that they couldn't conceive of necessarily at the end of World War II was the fact that all of the American small arms at that time were made by Springfield Armory or Winchester. Those two manufacturing facilities are within 80 miles of one another. So at the birth of the atomic bomb, it was clear that that could strategically be a bad thing with one attack taking out our entire capability to produce small arms. So another thing that made Harvester attractive to the government was at the time, their production facility was in Evansville, Indiana. They had bought in the Republic Aviation facility, who had been at the time making P-47 Thunderbolts, and they were going to try to make air conditioners there. They accepted the government contract for around 400,000 of these rifles. And as soon as the contract was signed, but before the ink was dry, Harvester's troubles began. It was an absolute manufacturing nightmare from the beginning, largely because they had sort of miscalculated how complex the M1 would be to build. Their thought process was that we make tractors, how hard can it be? Well, it's incredibly hard. Besides the receiver being the most complicated part, of course, then you have the barrel. Harvester never really was able to produce a barrel, so they actually farmed that process out to a company called Line Materials. Line Materials was at that time known for making telephone and electrical transmission equipment, and they had a very, very good reputation in the manufacturing world. They were based out of Alabama, which is where this barrel was made. That happy little accident was actually a good thing because they make extremely high quality barrels for the time, better than Springfield Armory even. This one is actually correct with the gun, meaning it is all of the numbers matched. This rifle belongs to a friend of the channel's, Mike Hindle. He had recently purchased the rifle through an online auction and was a successful bidder at right around $2,100. So as you can tell, the International Harvester Model M1 is still a very collectible and sought after item. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. One of the ways that you can tell that it's an International Harvester at first glance, of course, besides the stamp, is its wide protective ears on the front sight are actually much wider than they typically are when they're made by Springfield Armory or Winchester. Harvester began to start making the rifles sometime around 1951. This one dates from May of 1954. Their troubles were so numerous that the #2 guy at Springfield Armory actually had to move to Evansville, Indiana to sort out the problems. The guns were constantly jamming and malfunctioning due to spring tensions, all kinds of issues with the rifle. But the interesting thing is, one thing you can say for Harvester is even though they nearly went bankrupt, they didn't give up, and they actually did make quality rifles. It's a little bit of a misnomer to say because they had all of that trouble, there must be something wrong with the units, because there simply isn't. They hold up and are as accurate as any other M1 that you can find. Now, oddly enough, for whatever reason, at the end of the Korean War, Most of the Harvester rifles were actually once again sent out of the country for military aid. That's important because they couldn't come back into the country for commercial sale only if they were purchased by military or law enforcement personnel, which over the slow course of time did begin to happen. So the life of the Harvester is sometimes they were available and a lot of the times they weren't, and then they would kind of come back on the market in more prevalent numbers. Right around the mid-70s, they were very hard to find, and because they were sent out in such numbers, they still kind of are, and they're highly collectible amongst M1 fans. A lot of the receivers were also not made by International Harvester. It's very possible to pick up one of these rifles, and even though it says International Harvester on the stamp on the back of the receiver, a lot of those were actually made by Springfield Armory and stamped Harvester by them. There were 4 different styles of stamps on the back. Some were postage, some were arrowhead, and they do help you kind of date the rifle, but the serial number is probably the best way to go about it. And they made somewhere around 300,000 of these. The problems were so enormous that by 1955, Harvester had agreed to sell their Evansville plant to Whirlpool, who wanted it once again for air conditioning. Problem was, Harvester wanted them to take possession of it by January of '56, causing them to seek the government out for an early buyout, which they ultimately received. By 1958, the U.S. military had adopted the M1A1, or the M14. They, the government meaning, approached Harvester about potentially making that rifle, and they said not just no, but hell no, because of their experience they had had with the M1. Oddly enough, living right next door to Indiana, I had no idea of this history until my friend told me that he had just picked up this rifle. It's a really cool rabbit hole to go down, and it may or may not be a surprise based on your familiarity with the history of the M1. I know you can get a PhD in those sorts of things, and lots of people do, but it's a cool model, and I understand it to be a very smooth shooter. My friend Mike actually has 2 M1s, one of these being this one, and he claims this one shoots much smoother than his other one. So I'm going to load it up and see what all the fuss is about. You guys have probably noticed my Marine issue M1 cartridge belt carrier, and this is actually a correct bayonet from the Korean vintage, or from the Korean War. The pistol here is actually not authentic to World War II. It was owned by my friend Mike's father as he was in Japan on the pistol team. It's carrying an officer's model 1911-45. So this is pretty common in what you see with some reenactors, but I thought was kind of interesting is all of the pouches that one would have in heavy combat, and obviously you only get 8. So, you know, it looks like a lot, but if you do the math on the thing, it really isn't. Kind of a cool little piece that survived from World War II. The M1 Garand does function on an 8-round end block clip. Kind of a cool little deal. And of course you have to be careful about how you load the rifle or you'll end up with Garand thumb. That is a thing, not just the channel. Most of you probably already know that. I've already got the rifle loaded, so I'm just going to use around 8 rounds. But before I do, one of the things I think it's fair to mention if you're interested in picking up an M1 is that you have to be very careful about the 30-06 ammunition that you put in here. The maximum pressure that the rifle is rated for is only 50,000 PSI. So that means that you have to be careful if you purchased say a heavier round or any commercially made ammunition that shoots pressures in excess of that, you can fail the gun, and it has happened numerous times, and there goes your investment. Good rule of thumb is somewhere around 150 to 175 grain, traveling around 2,600 feet per second, should keep you under your 50,000 PSI. But once again, be careful and do your own homework. I know Hornady makes ammunition specific for it. This happens to be S&B Tactical. But once again, if you're not aware, don't run just any ammo through your M1 Garand because you could potentially fail it. And then obviously it could also cause you to be injured. So let's see what all the fuss is about. Cancel safety. it is smooth. Wow. Hopefully, after it bounced off my head, or maybe before, you heard that telltale ping. That is the signature sound made when the end block magazine is ejected from the rifle. One of the tactics soldiers would sometimes use in World War II to get the Germans or the Japanese to think that their rifle was empty, but they would keep these empty and kind of throw one so it'll make that sound, hopefully to bring them out on a charge. Not sure it worked all that well, but it is definitely a very distinctive sound. Smooth shooting rifle. I gotta tell you, you wouldn't know that you're actually firing a 30-06 the way this thing handles recoil. It's got a very long action rod in it, which helps. And I must tell you, once again, totally convinced, if need be, totally ready for any armed confrontation all of these years later. Hope you guys have enjoyed this deep dive into the International Harvester M1. It was a lot of fun to do the work and kind of see how all of this came to be based on political climate, location, and some other things. Quite an interesting story. See you next week.